This is IBM Museum. I would like this to be a rather short video. This is just the wrap up for now of the running the system information tool on the Model 80 that's a, in the factory configuration is a 20 megahertz 386DX model, and that is known as the Type 2 planar. And if you've watched the recent videos, we had a little bit of trouble with the Type 1, which is a 16 megahertz 386DX Model 80, and then went through to where even the system information tool was misreporting or just didn't know about the Type 2 as well. And so I'm going to, fire the machine up. I have, as you can see from the SkyCam, and this machine is stripped down. It does not have any hard drives or controllers, actually any adapters in it at all. I've pulled all that just to revert back to the basics. And of course we have the diskette drive still kind of hanging out there on top, as you can hear it seek. And we do have the boot diskette for the system information tool. And so let's go over to that now that we hear it booting. Okay. And I don't have an autoexec.bat in this sit boot disk. So just pressing there, it's going to prompt me for the time and date. And since it has the correct time and date, I can do that. Now on this diskette, let's just do a brief directory showing things. Okay. And I've got of course, the command.com, and there's two hidden MS-DOS files. There's this, as it's readable on the screen, is MS-DOS version 5. And so that normally has the QBasic program included with it and edit. You have to have version 5. You have to have those matched up with the DOS versions, the MS-DOS versions that they were released with, or it'll complain. It won't run those programs. And of course, we verified that all that stuff runs on the previous video. But I had to throw that in for just how the system information tool was interpreting the planar ID that was being reported. And, again, these are the supported models. And Major Tom composed these from the aspect of, these were in the original unpatched, as they're listed there. That first listing of being the Type 1, having no space between model and 80, as you can see in that chart. And then the system that we're testing now is the Type 2 that's shown below it. BIOS model F8 hex, 01 hex for the BIOS submodel, and a true planar ID of FDFF. And that was where we were encountering the issues, is that I was getting, my machine was throwing out a different planar ID. And if we're going to have that happen tonight, I'll be able to react to it, and I'll show how that is. Major Tom did give me a little bit of input on things that we tried. And this video is not all the way done. I mean, it is, there's bound to be a little bit of follow-up that I do later on to finish this up. But this is as much as we can go through. I want to get through where the system information tool is going to show that correct model identification. So I'm actually doing, and there's a Type 3 Model 80 that's listed later in the chart, and that is the model that was based on the 25 megahertz 386DX in the factory configuration. And normally that was known as the model 8580 dash AXX. The A meaning that it was the 25 megahertz planar in there, or a type 3 planar that was in there. And I'm going to run that as a separate video. And I'm hoping I'm not going to get bogged down the same way with the type 3 as much as we did for the type 1 and type 2. So let's go through and just try and run that patched C version of the system information tool. And that's how I have it laid out, of the original just being the sit.exe, sit_A being the first patch that Major Tom did in correcting that that string with the type 1 is one of the patches that he did within that. And I'm trying to think of the other. He's got actually release notes that he's gone through as he's patched these. And then I've got the sit_B for that later patch that went through, opened up a lot more of the adapter slots, in particular the P70 unit. Instead of just having that one slot as shown as the chart, now reports the full 4 slots. And then even that for the Model 55SX and Model 70, the 55LS, going through and reporting a 4 slot where that DBA ESDI controller and drive. That's all in, of course, one drive unit connected to the system. But that was the fix for that B patch. And then the C patch going through and correcting the planar ID for the type 1 that made it work finally. But then us having trouble with the type 2 being identified correctly with the planar ID. But I was seeing in some cases, and it's still repeatable to me, I've got to go through and get to the bottom of this, to where it goes through and doesn't identify that planar ID correctly. More so on the type 2 than any other system I've tested so far. There just appears something quirky going on behind the scenes. And that's why we've come up with this minimal machine. We get to see the nice splash screen there, with credits to Major Tom for doing that. And of course, just in this video, the only thing that we're concerned about is that model and processor information. And I guess I could get my screen behind me, showing the same thing, so I can look at it and not get the lag time. So, because I did have the lag time, I skipped to the next listing. So model and processor information, that is what we are interested in. And everything is good. The system did not kick up any problems in this time, which is good. So it's showing is the IBM PS2 Model 80, the 80386 being that 386DX CPU at speed of 20 megahertz. And, for this stripped down system, and I also considered that, when you go through and you do CPU upgrades and things like that, that can have a weird influence on systems sometimes. But as we see in the SkyCam, this is the stock, right below this bar of the drive cage. That is the stock 386DX 20 megahertz. And then I've got the math coprocessor that identifies on the screen that 80387. If I get to where it showed the screen again. And then it has that BIOS model of F8. And that is, again, all models that were from IBM that were 386SX or above. They had that generic F8 listing, and it was overused and a lot of things. And there's a lot of, but actually there's all the supported models for that first column, and I'll provide a link in the video again for this, all the models in that column are F8 hex. And just because to be a true supported model by the system information tool, it has to be a 386 SX or above. It doesn't report the 286 or the earlier models based on the 8086 of the PS2s correctly at all. And so we've got that F8 for the BIOS model. The submodel, as we saw on the chart, that 01, meaning it's the Type 2 based on the Type 2 planar. And the BIOS revision, it is a 00. It was the only version that was released of that BIOS. And this has a little bit later release. This being the next step up in how the Model 80 evolved, being the 20 megahertz instead of the 16 megahertz. That slower speed was released first. This BIOS is October the 7th of 1987. And the system board POS ID, or the planar ID, as it's referred to, is absolutely correct in this instance of FDFF. And I'll give a link to the planar ID page as well. I've gone through and I've modified that. I've corrected some entries in there, and I'll go through and I'll proof a lot of that just to make sure that I've got those models correct, because I did have the Type 1 and Type 2 planar IDs mixed up on my planar ID page. So I'll go through and be going through and checking that, doing empirical testing against the PS2 models to make sure that I get the planar ID, the correct one reported. But at least it shows up correctly in this case. And so we didn't have the system really kick up anything at all on this run. And there's undoubtedly, I'll go through and I'll run the system information tool. I'll redo the video of the Type 2 in its entirety and have a more structured process at a later point. I just want to go through once the problems are resolved. And sure, I can give footnotes at the start if there's any little program that you have to run on a Type 2 to kind of clean up the system or make it report the correct values. I'll address those in that issue, but I want to get to the point where I have the going through and showing the system information tool in the system where I don't really necessarily run into any problems and able to go through and keep a good schedule of the video and things like that. Now, that aside, me and Major Tom are grateful for the system information tool and other things that we check kicking up errors sometimes, because then it allows us to check our information, to go through and verify and just ping information off each other of what may have gone wrong and going through and correcting that. The big benefit for me is going through when I write the revision of the system information tool that I have, tried to do for a lot of years now, both a Windows version and DOS version, for me to go through and address those issues so my program works correctly and actually provides better information, not the hard-coded values that the system information tool does, but going through there and reading those values and being more correct, likely being bigger and everything else, but just being a better implementation of it. And, we have to go through and even and verify things. Major Tom went through and he pulled out his Type 2 Model 80 as well to look it over, to run through the same checks I was doing. And I had to go through in this case and strip down that model so much, have a unit with just that base CPU on there, no adapters, run it just purely from the diskette drive to get the thing to behave correctly for me. Now, Also and this will be coming on when I go through and do the system information tool on the Type 3 Model 80. That Model 80 with the 25 megahertz 386DX CPU. And this is, I'll go through, and I'd like to have and it's easy in this case because I have the unit open. I've got the SkyCam, but I'd like to go through when I go over the system information tool. I can also probably do a little bit of have a planar for a section of the video and not necessarily be running the program itself, but going through and covering the layout of the planar and just more of an information video of the unit in addition to running the system information tool on it. Providing other information as far as the CPU, the floating point unit, or where the socket is if the model I have doesn't have it. And you can see it's not so visible with the SkyCam here until I hold the planar up that I have. And that would be the purpose for me showing the planar, is also showing all these, if I can hold it steady enough, all these bodge wires, all these patches. And this is a released planar, that IBM had to go through and just to patch this board with whatever level to get it things that were missed in building the system, and it having just little loop wires and all sorts of things around that they had to do. This one doesn't have anything on the back, but starting with the Type 3, I'll be going through and giving a little bit of rundown of what the planar looks like, the features. And I know we have those diagrams on the Ardent tool that show them, but there's no replacement sometimes for just showing what the planar looks like in person and pointing out the various things. So that's my intent moving forward. I was glad to kind of wrap this up for now. There's going to be more follow-up with the Type 2 Model 80 planar. If you enjoyed the video, click on the like button. Please subscribe to my channel to get notified when these new videos come out. But that is all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.